an example of the model of a piece done in styrofoam, cast in aluminum, and the model then being used to create a sculpture in scale. This is called Woman on a Toboggan. Now, this kind of thing, it's you have the model, you don't have to make a drawing, but it's all done by measuring and enlarging, cutting and welding. And I was very interested already in flat surfaces in that particular piece. Now, this piece, for instance, comes to part in 4 or 5 elements. As I say, with styrofoam, I began on a route which eventually led me to the machine tool pieces. This is another one of some small pieces done in styrofoam, assembled, cast, and then polished and assembled in aluminum. Woman on the waves. You may notice the flat areas are not really flat, and that will come up in another piece. Now this is, again, it's an example of a small sculpture. It comes apart in several elements using styrofoam, which, as I say, became a very precious auxiliary material. Styrofoam has the capacity of, if you perch something out on the end of it, or you project it out, or you attach something to it, you can glue it, pin it. It doesn't need any armature. If you do the same thing in plaster or wax, it usually, many times, has to have an armature. So it leaves the sculptor very free to conceive the forms he does as he feels them. At least it suited my work absolutely perfectly. This is the piece that led me to the machine tool pieces. Again, you know, sometimes developments in one works come out of very strange incidents. Jim McGee will recognize this piece because he may have worked on this piece or some other, but what really obsessed me with it was the business of filing flat. And filing flat technically is a very difficult thing to do, and very boring and very time consuming. And I was working on this, like, was at a friend's house for dinner, and I was complaining bitterly about the time it took to make the flat surface. I said, "Oh, go out of my mind." And there was a man there at dinner, a friend of my friends, and I had another piece in my studio in styrofoam, and I gave the piece to him. It's called the Tissot Dupont cigarette lighter. And this was a man who ran, they have a big factory in Annecy, and they have lots of little small industry providers. He took the styrofoam thing off. They did the piece. No drawing, no nothing. They just had the styrofoam piece, and it intrigued him. And he enjoyed that immensely. And from this piece, I don't know if you can see now, this surface in here, this concave surface, you see that that's concave. Well, on that piece, I learned that you don't do that on machine tool pieces. I show you this because on this piece, I learned some of the possibilities that existed for the surfaces. The way the surface takes the light, that surface becomes a part of the vocabulary that the artist is working with. Projectile piece that's upstairs, which of course you've seen, which I have the honor of it being in the collection now of the museum. I had this piece, and I said to Michel, you know, what, can we do this one? And he said, well, you'll have to make a drawing for that. I learned to make the drawings of each element in the sculpture that would compose it with its precise measurements and all, so that when he had somebody who was going to work on it, they had an exact plan to follow. And that was the necessary translation between what I was doing and the people who were going to do the work, because this man also was very kind, because I could not afford myself to have my own machine tools. He invited me down to Annecy, and he had a couple of old machine tools that were no longer in use because they were kind of outdated. They were too small, or they weren't automated or something, and we're getting into that then. And I made a couple of pieces myself so that I could understand exactly what they could do and could not do. My curiosity is what drives me forward. What is not affected, really, is what emerges. This is not a machine tool. This is the result of using these huge industrial saws. You start out with a block, and you cut and cut so that you can derive that form, which then receives there's a lot involved too in these pieces of figuring out how they can fit into each other without dislocating, without falling, how the way in which the joints are made prevent any piece from moving. But it becomes, as I say, it becomes a vocabulary. I'll make a comment on this last piece, which is upstairs. This is a curious thing because the piece in the middle, this element, was one of the things I did down there on those machine tools myself, but I brought it back kind of as a souvenir. I didn't know what to do with it. It's a good example. And then finally, I had the idea of making a piece that could move, change positions. I'll just say that you see this kind of tongue and groove joint here that allows this to be displaced all laterally. Every element can be displaced laterally so that you can compose and recompose the sculpture a bit as you wish. But the final thought of the sculpture was that I had this, which was cut with a milling machine, and I designed this sort of cloud so that when the milling on this side conforms and goes right into the next throat of the next milling gesture down here, on the other side, they don't fit together. And it's just like in people's lives, they get one thing going and then something else is out of joint. It was the kind of the point of the piece. Now this is the S111. The piece is called McGee because I cared about who I gave it to that much. But the original, this was a time when people were interested in multiples. That is to say, pieces of sculpture that can be produced industrially. My idea with this piece was to make 11 elements to it, which can be composed in any way. I tried to do something in which the person who owned the piece buys the pieces and composes it, but I tried to do it in such a way that he could not come up with something that I would not approve of. In other words, it's like making a corral for his thought. Now, this was done in aluminum, but you can see here, here's the groove. It's all tongue and groove fitting. Right here, this is a slanted cut. So that the piece slides in, but it can't fall forward. Anyhow, without getting into all those details, aluminum was the wrong material. Because when you take it apart and put it together many times, the aluminum becomes bruised. It makes like little cowlicks. But now if you have a tiny little file, you can get rid of that and get the piece going, but you cannot sell a sculpture to somebody with a little tiny file and a piece of sandpaper, saying if it ever gets stuck, just use these. And the pieces, the series could have been done in a kind of industrial bronze, which is hard enough, or in stainless steel, but as you can well imagine, my means never allowed me to get that far. But this is one of, there were 11 of them made, and they're in different places in the world. I don't even have one. Anyhow, my work in this machine tool pieces went up to that point. Then I got very interested in the idea of multiples. Now that fell through because simply, I remember talking to a dealer I liked very much about the idea of multiples. I finally realized that the art market is not interested in multiples. They're interested in unique things. And they weren't filled with any sort of no idealistic idea about something becoming available to a lot of people, nor using market research techniques for the development of multiples. I understood that, and I'm not a sociologist, so I just dropped the whole thing.